In a city that flaunted progress while hiding its failures, the homeless were seen as blight, lives to be erased, not saved. Councilman Robert Haynes wanted the streets cleaned, and men like Ethan Cross answered the call. To Cross, violence was business, and fear kept the streets quiet. When his eyes landed on Derek Williams, just another black man under a ragged tarp, he saw nothing but weakness, another easy target to chase off. What Cross couldn't see was the soldier beneath the worn clothes, a man forged in war, who had stood his ground in places where running meant death. Derek had survived battles far worse than this. Cross thought he was sweeping away another nameless face. Instead, he had awakened a man who knew how to fight back. And this time, Derek wasn't fighting for orders. He was fighting for home. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The morning sun crept hesitantly over the city skyline, its golden light barely piercing through the thick smog that hung over the streets like an unshakable curse. The city stirred beneath the haze, but it was not the kind of awakening that brought hope. It was a reluctant stirring, a reminder that the world kept moving even for those it had long since abandoned. The sidewalks, cracked and uneven, carried the footprints of those who had nowhere else to go, shadows of lives once full of promise, now reduced to mere survival. Among them was Derek Williams, his boots worn but steady, his shoulders squared despite the weight of the life he now carried. He moved with quiet purpose through the makeshift encampment under the overpass, where rows of tarps and tattered blankets formed a fragile sense of home. The worn fabrics flapped weakly in the breeze, barely shielding those beneath them from the cold reality of their existence. The air carried a mixture of stale coffee, burning wood, and something more troubling, the unshakable scent of unease. The homeless community had always lived on edge, but something in the air felt heavier lately. Fear lingered like a permanent fog. Derek paused by a rusted barrel fire, its flames flickering weakly against the morning chill. An older man with sunken eyes and trembling hands warmed himself there, his face etched with lines that told stories no one wanted to hear. Charlie, one of the oldest in the camp, barely acknowledged Derek's presence. His mind seemed distant, lost to whatever demons had claimed him long ago. Derek knelt beside him, the ground damp beneath his knee, and set down a can of soup. "Eat, old man. Can't have you wasting away on me," Derek said, his voice firm but not unkind. Charlie blinked slowly, his eyes momentarily finding focus. He gave a faint nod, but Derek knew better than to expect thanks. He wasn't here for gratitude. He was here because this was his family now, broken, battered, but still his. Nearby, a woman coughed violently into a threadbare sleeve, her body racked with each spasm. Maria Lopez, once a nurse who had tended to others with care and precision, now faced the same brutal struggle as the rest of them. Her eyes, tired yet defiant, met Derek's. She forced a weak smile, but it did little to mask the fear beneath it. They both knew the truth. Smiles couldn't chase away what was coming. The rumors had reached everyone. The streets weren't just cold. They were turning hostile. Whispers crept through the camp like a poison, men prowling in the night, their presence marked by the remains they left behind, beaten bodies, shattered belongings, entire encampments ransacked or set ablaze. Each story carried the same message. Someone wanted them gone, and they weren't asking nicely. Derek felt the weight of it pressing down on him, a growing tension in his chest. He had seen violence before, but this was different. This was calculated. This was a warning, and he knew it was only the beginning. Derek adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, his trained eyes scanning the streets beyond their camp. Every subtle shift in the atmosphere registered in his mind. He had spent enough time in war zones to know when something was brewing, and right now, everything felt too still, too calculated. A calm before the storm. The kind of quiet that pressed on your chest and made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. He knew danger when he smelled it, and it was thick in the air now. Across the street, half hidden in the shadows of a rundown building, with cracked windows and graffiti-covered walls. A group of young men loitered, their postures relaxed, but their eyes predatory. There was a difference between aimless wanderers and those with purpose. Derek could see it in their gaze. They weren't just passing through. They were watching, assessing, measuring their surroundings like wolves circling vulnerable prey. Derek exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool morning air. His instincts told him these weren't random thugs looking for a cheap thrill. They were hunters. And the homeless, his people, were their prey. The sun inched higher over the smog-choked skyline, casting pale light across the decaying cityscape. But the warmth never truly touched the streets below. The cold remained, clinging to the concrete and to the bones of those who called this place home. Derek stood near the edge of the encampment, his eyes still locked on the group of young men across the street. The same ones who had been watching earlier. They lingered just long enough to ensure their presence was noticed before drifting away into the maze of crumbling buildings and narrow alleys. But Derek knew better than to take comfort in their departure. Their absence was not an end, but a pause. They'd be back. They always came back. He turned from the street, stepping over broken bottles and discarded syringes as he made his way deeper into the camp. The ground beneath his boots was damp and uneven, a grim mosaic of debris and human struggle. The air felt heavier now, rumors of those attacks gnawing at the edges of every conversation. He could hear the murmurs, the same fearful stories passed from one shelter to the next. Camps torn apart in the dead of night, residents beaten beyond recognition, or simply vanishing into the shadows. Each tale grew darker, fueling the anxiety that bound the camp together. But Derek had other duties to tend to. His first stop was Maria Lopez, hunched beside her makeshift shelter, a flimsy frame of plastic sheets and old tarps, barely holding together against the elements. She struggled to patch a large tear with strips of fabric from a child's jacket, her hands trembling, not just from the cold, but from the relentless weight of survival pressing down on her. Derek knelt beside her, his voice low but steady. "You'll lose more heat like that," he murmured. "Here, try this." He dug into his worn duffel and produced a small roll of duct tape. The silver surface was scuffed and dirty, but it would do the job. Maria paused, her hands still trembling as she looked at him with watery eyes. For a moment, the weight of everything pressed down on her, her defenses cracking under the strain. She glanced down at the frayed fabric in her lap, the small, tattered jacket that had once belonged to a child. Her voice was soft, almost breaking. "It was my son's," she whispered. "All I have left of him." Derek nodded, his face unreadable, but his heart clenched. He knew there were no words to mend that kind of wound. Some losses stayed with you, like a scar across the soul. He simply handed her the tape, and together they worked in silence, sealing the gaps in the shelter. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't pretty, but it would hold, at least for a little while longer. Later, near the far end of the camp, Derek found Kevin Smiley Harris leaning against a concrete wall, his arms folded, his usual grin nowhere to be seen. Behind him, bold black spray paint scarred the bricks with a message: "Clean up." The letters stretched across the wall like a brand, a warning, a threat, sloppy, but deliberate. Derek traced it with his eyes, his gut tightening. He had seen the same message sprayed near other encampments across the city. Each time, it came before violence. Smiley noticed his stare. "They're not even hiding it now." Derek crossed his arms, his jaw set like stone. "What happened?" "Last night," Smiley muttered, his voice quieter than usual. 8th Street camp. They hit hard, took their stuff, roughed up the old folks. Benny's gone. Derek exhaled through his nose. Benny had been a fixture on the streets, harmless, quiet, and too frail to put up a fight. If they took him, this wasn't just about pushing people out. This was about control, power, fear. "We're next," Smiley added, his voice low and certain. Derek glanced around the camp. People moved through their routines, but it was hollow. Every gesture weighed down by dread. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men sat together but spoke in hushed tones. Everyone was waiting for something. Derek knew what it was. The storm was coming. That evening, as the sky darkened into a bruised shade of purple, Derek found Maria sitting by a small fire. She cradled a tin cup of weak coffee, her eyes distant, haunted by exhaustion and dread. "I used to be a nurse," she whispered. Her voice cracked under the weight of memories. "Worked at the hospital downtown. Saved lives. Now, I can't even keep myself safe." Maria's gaze flickered downward, eyes fixed on the faint steam rising from her tin cup. Her fingers tightened around it, as if holding on to the past. She wasn't talking just about safety. She was talking about dignity, about purpose. Everything stripped away. Derek placed a hand on her shoulder. Strong, steady, the kind of touch that carried more than comfort. It carried solidarity. "You're still saving lives. We all need you," he said, his tone low but sure. Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill over. She blinked rapidly, trying to fight them back. But Derek's words cut through the despair like a blade. She nodded, clutching onto those few words like a lifeline. Because sometimes, hope was nothing more than hearing that you still mattered. Miles away, in a dim office overlooking the polished city center, Councilman Robert Haynes leaned forward slightly, his suit crisp, his tie perfectly knotted. Across from him sat Ethan Cross, young, brash, dangerous in all the wrong ways. Haynes tapped his finger against a folder on his desk. Inside were redevelopment plans worth millions, blueprints for new apartments, shopping centers, progress, as the city would call it. But progress had a price, and the homeless camps were in the way. His voice was smooth, practiced. Years in politics had made him fluent in hiding cruelty beneath civility. "I need them gone, Cross," quietly. Cross leaned back in his chair, his cocky smirk slipping, if only for a second. His gang had been roughing up the camps for weeks, stealing, beating, burning. But Haynes's tone was different now. Sharper, edged with impatience. "We're working on it," Cross replied. His voice carried false confidence. "But these folks, they scatter fast." Haynes slid an envelope across the polished desk. Cash. Thick. No paper trail. His eyes didn't leave Cross's face. "Try harder." Cross's fingers hovered over the envelope. He could feel the weight of it, but his instincts told him this was more than a cleanup job. This was about power, about making people disappear. And men like Haynes didn't tolerate failure. Cross was a tool, useful, but disposable. He forced his smirk back into place, masking his unease. He pocketed the cash. "Consider it done." Back under the overpass, Derek stared into the flames of the small fire, his mind racing. He didn't know their names, Haynes, Cross, but he could feel them. Their influence stained every brick wall marked with "clean up." Their greed whispered in every story of another destroyed camp. The sun hung low, casting long streaks of orange across the stained concrete. Derek moved through the camp, his patrol routine unchanged, but his thoughts spiraling. His eyes scanned every alley, every shadow. His steps were steady, but the tension wrapped tighter around his chest. Something was coming, and he would be ready. Derek had seen the watchers again that morning. Different faces, but the same cold, lingering stares from across the street. They stood just far enough to avoid confrontation, but their eyes told the truth. They were sizing up the camp, waiting for the right moment. Derek knew their kind. Predators circling weak prey. They weren't ready to make their move yet, but he could feel it in his bones. It was coming. As Derek rounded the corner past a sagging chain-link fence, his ears picked up the unmistakable sound of raised voices, sharp, aggressive. His body tensed. The tone was all too familiar. He quickened his pace, boots crunching over gravel, rounding the back of an abandoned loading dock, where a small cluster of homeless often gathered during the day. What he saw made his blood run cold. Frank Turner, a frail older man, his body bent by years of street life, was backed against a rusted dumpster. His thin frame shook beneath the rough hands of 3 young men. Derek recognized them instantly. Faces he had seen hovering on the outskirts. They had been watching the camp, circling like vultures. The leader, scar-faced, wore a red hoodie pulled tight over his head. Next to him was a shorter one in a beanie, his mouth twisted into a sneer. The third was tall and wiry, his smirk dripping with malice. They weren't just here to scare Frank. They were here to dominate him, to claim territory. Frank's hands trembled as he raised them in surrender, his voice brittle. "Please, I don't have nothin'." Scarface shoved him hard into the dumpster, metal clanging as Frank's back hit it. "I said, get your junk out of here, old man. This is our spot now." His voice was full of mock authority, power stolen from those weaker than him. The wiry one stepped forward and, without hesitation, kicked Frank's shopping cart. It toppled over, sending his few possessions spilling onto the ground. Blankets, cans, a small plastic radio, everything he had scraped together. The radio cracked apart on the pavement, its fragile insides scattered. Derek's heart hardened. He had seen this kind of bullying before. Different places, different uniforms, but always the same. Weak men puffing their chests, feeding on the powerless. He felt the familiar heat rising in his chest, sharpening his senses. There were no rifles here, no body armor. But it didn't matter. The feeling was the same. He stepped forward, his voice steady, cutting through their taunts like a blade. "Let him go." The gang turned, surprised. Derek stood tall, shoulders squared, his eyes locked on the scar-faced thug. There was no bluster, no raised voice, just a calm authority that demanded attention. The kind of voice that came from experience, from knowing what real violence looked like. Scarface sneered. But Derek saw it, the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Bullies always hesitated when faced with someone who wouldn't bend. "This ain't your business, old man." Derek didn't flinch. His stare remained cold, unyielding. "It is now. Let him go." The wiry one, tall one, stepped in closer, his fists clenching, his smirk twisting into something nastier. He was trying to puff himself up, but Derek could see through it. False confidence. "You think you're some kind of tough guy? You want next?" Derek didn't waste another breath. He moved. His boot snapped forward into tall one's knee with brutal precision. A sickening crack echoed in the alley. The man crumpled, his howl of agony cutting through the air. Derek didn't hesitate. He stepped in, driving his elbow hard into tall one's temple. The impact was final. The man hit the ground like a stone, out cold. Scarface reacted, lunging with a wild swing, but Derek was already turning. He ducked, fluid and sharp, slipping behind him in a single motion. He locked Scarface's arm and shoved him forward with force. Scarface's face collided with the brick wall. Blood smeared the rough surface as he slumped down, clutching his nose. Beanie came next, clutching a rusted pipe like a weapon. He rushed forward, desperation replacing bravado. Derek saw the attack before it landed. He angled his body, raising his arm to block. The metal bit into his forearm, sending pain flaring up his arm. But Derek gritted his teeth and used the momentum. He seized the pipe and yanked Beanie forward, his knee slamming into Beanie's gut with brutal efficiency. Beanie's breath left him in a sharp wheeze. He doubled over, but Derek wasn't done. He followed through with a quick, hammering fist to Beanie's jaw. The younger man hit the ground hard, gasping, dazed. All 3 were down, but Derek knew better. They weren't out. Scarface groaned, pushing himself up, blood dripping from his nose. His eyes burned with rage and humiliation. He spat a thick glob of red onto the concrete. "Get him!" he snarled. Tall one, clutching his injured leg, stumbled upright, his face twisted in pain and anger. Beanie wiped the blood from his split lip, his shock giving way to seething fury. They locked eyes briefly, exchanging a wordless agreement. This time, they wouldn't charge blindly. They circled Derek. More cautious now, their movements slower but calculated. Derek's breathing deepened, steady and controlled. His fists tightened, knuckles white. He shifted his stance, feet firmly grounded, shoulders loose, ready. His eyes flicked between them, scanning for weaknesses, searching for the moment they would break formation. They came together. Tall One lunged first, grabbing Derek's arm with both hands, trying to hold him in place. Beanie followed in quick succession, swinging the rusted pipe in a downward arc, aimed at Derek's head. Derek reacted instinctively. He wrenched his arm free from Tall One's grip and ducked under the pipe, feeling the whoosh of air as it narrowly missed his skull. Using his momentum, Derek drove his shoulder into Beanie's ribs with brutal force, sending him sprawling backward into Scarface, who had been regaining his footing. Scarface recovered quickly. Too quickly. His hand shot to his waistband, drawing a knife. The blade was jagged, cheap steel with a chipped edge. But Derek knew it didn't matter. A knife didn't need to be pretty to kill. Derek's eyes locked onto the weapon. His muscles tensed. Knife fights were never clean. They were fast, brutal, and often ended with both men bleeding, if one of them was lucky enough to walk away at all. Scarface lunged, slashing low toward Derek's gut. Derek pivoted backward, the blade slicing through the air just inches from his stomach. He avoided the worst of it, but was forced into a defensive stance. His feet shifted carefully. He couldn't afford a single misstep. Tall One, still limping but stubborn, seized the opening. He lunged from behind, wrapping his arms around Derek's torso, locking him in place. Derek gritted his teeth. He planted his foot hard onto Tall One's toes, eliciting a pained grunt. Without hesitation, Derek snapped his head backward, the back of his skull smashing into Tall One's nose. A sickening crunch followed. The grip weakened, but Scarface was relentless. He pressed forward, stabbing toward Derek's ribs. Derek twisted, but the knife sliced across his side, tearing through his jacket and skin. A searing pain followed, and warm blood trickled down his waist. The pain sharpened Derek's focus. He lunged forward, trapping Scarface's wrist in an iron grip. With a sharp twist, Derek forced the hand open, the knife clattering onto the ground. Scarface snarled, his teeth bared in rage, trying to wrench his arm free from Derek's iron grip. But Derek was faster. He drove his boot into Scarface's knee, twisting it inward. A sharp yelp escaped Scarface's lips as he stumbled back, clutching his leg. Before Derek could capitalize, Beanie saw his chance. He swung the rusted pipe again, this time finding its mark, slamming into Derek's shoulder with a heavy, bone-rattling crack. Pain exploded down Derek's arm, radiating through his chest, but he gritted his teeth and refused to falter. Pain was familiar. He had endured worse in places far from this alley. He drove forward, body low, tackling Beanie to the ground. The impact jarred both men as they hit the cold concrete, limbs entangling in a brutal scramble. They rolled, grappling, fists flying. Derek landed 2 rapid punches to Beanie's ribs, each strike punctuated by a grunt. But Beanie's desperation pushed him further. His hand fumbled along the ground until it closed around a jagged shard of glass. With a wild snarl, he slashed upward. Derek caught his wrist just in time. Their arms trembled, veins bulging, as they wrestled for control. The glass gleamed inches from Derek's face, close enough for him to see his reflection in its uneven surface. Scarface wasn't done. He re-entered the fray with a brutal kick to Derek's ribs, the impact sending shock waves through his core. Derek grunted, the air driven from his lungs as he rolled onto his side, clutching his torso. His vision blurred for a second, but he forced himself to stay alert. There was no room for weakness. Tall One stumbled over, his nose still gushing blood, staining his chin and shirt. He wavered, but stayed upright. His eyes burned with vengeance. Now all 3 loomed over Derek, panting, battered, but still fueled by violence and pride. Scarface wiped the blood trickling from his mouth with the back of his hand. His lips curled into a snarl. "You think you're tough? We'll show you tough." Derek's chest heaved, breaths quick and shallow. He could feel the situation spiraling. This wasn't just a beating. They wanted to break him. He needed to end this, now. Scarface raised the knife again, his knuckles white around the handle. Derek's gaze darted to Frank, still huddled by the dumpster. The old man's eyes were wide with terror. His frail fingers gripped a brick, but fear anchored him in place. He was too scared to act. The knife came down. Derek rolled, the blade grazing the ground with a metallic scrape. He lashed out with his boot, connecting with Scarface's knee once more, sending him sprawling onto the pavement with a guttural curse. Derek surged forward, reaching for the knife, but Beanie grabbed his collar, yanking him backward. Before Derek could react, Tall One's fist crashed into his jaw. Pain burst through his skull, his vision flashing white. Stars burst in Derek's vision, but his instincts overrode the pain. He twisted his body, using Beanie's grip against him, dragging the younger man forward and slamming him hard into Tall One. The two stumbled, limbs tangling as they fought to regain their balance. Bodies collided. Yells filled the alley, echoing off the brick walls. It was a blur of fists, steel, and blood. Derek fought like a cornered animal. Every strike designed to cripple. Every block meant to survive. He aimed for weak points, knees, ribs, throats, anything to buy space. But they were relentless. Scarface, Beanie, and Tall One swarmed him like vultures, their movements more desperate, but their numbers grinding him toward exhaustion. Derek's breath grew heavier. His muscles burned. His vision wavered. He knew he couldn't keep this pace much longer. Then he heard it. The faint shuffle of feet from the street beyond the alley. Heavy, purposeful strides. More of them. Reinforcements. Derek's pulse spiked. His eyes darted toward the mouth of the alley. Two more figures emerged. Thugs with baseball bats in hand. Their expressions were cold, confident. They knew this was more than a beating. This was the beginning of the end. Frank's voice cracked through the chaos. "They're bringing more!" His shout trembled with fear, but it was loud enough to jolt Derek's focus. Derek gritted his teeth, adrenaline surging. He threw Beanie off him with a final heave, sending the thug sprawling against the wall. Derek staggered to his feet, chest heaving, his lips split, blood trailing from the gash at his side. Pain screamed through his body, but he pushed it aside. His eyes locked on the approaching thugs. The bats gleamed under the dim light. Scarface noticed Derek looking and sneered through swollen lips. "Now you're dead." Derek didn't respond. He didn't need to. He tightened his fists, feeling his knuckles throb. His ribs ached. His shoulder pulsed with pain, but his mind sharpened. This was it. The real fight was about to begin. The thudding of heavy footsteps echoed off the alley walls as the two newcomers closed in, their bats gripped like weapons of finality. Scarface, Beanie, and Tall One, bruised, bleeding, but emboldened by reinforcements, spread out, boxing Derek in, 5 against 1. Derek shifted his stance, blood dripping from his side onto the cracked concrete below. If this was how it ended, he was going to make damn sure they remembered him. Derek's breathing was ragged, each inhale scraping against his ribs like broken glass. His side throbbed fiercely where the knife had grazed him, and warm blood dampened his shirt, clinging to his skin. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he ignored it. His stance remained firm, feet planted, knees slightly bent, eyes scanning every movement around him, mind calculating. He had to survive. The first bat came for his head, fast. Derek ducked low, his instincts driving him before thought could form. He felt the rush of air as the wooden bat sliced through the space where his skull had been a split second earlier. Without hesitating, Derek surged forward, his shoulder slamming into the attacker's gut. The impact drove the thug backward into a stack of rusted metal crates. The bat slipped from his hands, clattering noisily to the ground. Derek capitalized. He raised his elbow and cracked it across the man's jaw with brutal precision. The thug crumpled, limbs limp as he hit the concrete. The second bat wielder was already closing in, swinging low, aiming for Derek's legs. Derek twisted his hips just in time. The bat scraped against his thigh, sending a jolt of pain up his leg. But he didn't let it buckle him. He gritted his teeth and absorbed the blow. His hands shot forward, locking around the thug's wrist. With a fierce yank, Derek pulled him off balance, dragging him down. He drove his knee up into the man's chest with all his strength. A guttural, breathless grunt escaped the attacker's lips as he doubled over and collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. But there was no pause. Scarface saw his chance. He lunged. Derek barely got his arms up in time. Scarface's fists hammered against his forearms, each blow jarring his bones, sending sharp spikes of pain through his body. Derek grunted under the assault, but held his ground. Then he struck back. He snapped his head forward, smashing his forehead into Scarface's face. The crunch of cartilage was unmistakable. Blood burst from Scarface's nose, spraying across Derek's chest. But before Derek could press the advantage, Tall One surged from behind. His arms locked around Derek's waist in a desperate tackle, trying to drag him to the ground. Derek's boots slid forward an inch, his knees nearly buckling. But he planted himself, refusing to go down. With a growl, Derek shifted his weight and snapped his head back. The hard bone of his skull connected with Tall One's cheekbone with a sickening crack. Tall One cried out, his grip weakening. Derek seized the moment, twisting free. He turned sharply, driving a precise punch to the side of Tall One's head. The impact was solid. Bone meeting bone. Tall One's eyes glazed over as his body crumpled to the ground once more, this time staying down. The alley erupted into chaos. Shouts echoed off the brick walls. Heavy breathing, grunts of pain, and the scrape of shoes on concrete filled the air. The gang's attacks were clumsy, but fueled by aggression. Raw street brutality clashing against Derek's trained resilience. Each of their movements was wild, desperate, while Derek's were calculated, honed from years of experience. At the far end of the alley, Frank had retreated even further. He pressed his back against the cold brick wall, clutching his torn blanket as though it might shield him from the violence. His wide, frightened eyes darted between Derek and the gang. Beyond him, a few other homeless faces peeked out from behind dumpsters and tattered tarps, silent witnesses. Fear etched into their expressions. They understood what this meant. This wasn't just a fight, this was war, a message. Derek's gaze flicked downward, his eyes landing on the bat lying near his foot. Without hesitation, he bent down, snatching it up. The smooth wood was cool in his hands, solid. A shift in power. Scarface noticed immediately. His bloodied lips twisted into a snarl. He spat onto the ground, crimson mixing with dirt. "You think you can take all of us? We run these streets." Derek's grip tightened around the bat. His knuckles whitened. He didn't waste breath answering. Words wouldn't stop these men, only action would. Beanie made the first move, reckless and panicked. He lunged, fists swinging wildly, hoping to overwhelm Derek. But Derek sidestepped with practiced ease. He drove the bat into Beanie's ribs, hard and deliberate. A dull, sickening thud rang out. Beanie crumpled to the ground, clutching his side, gasping like a fish pulled from water. Scarface and the last thug faltered. Derek saw it in their eyes. The shift. The balance was tipping. Doubt was creeping in. But before anyone could act, a voice cut through the tension. Low, confident, and laced with authority. "Enough!" The gang froze. Derek didn't lower the bat, but his eyes shifted toward the mouth of the alley. A man stood there, calm, composed, arms crossed over his chest. Ethan Cross, the leader. Derek knew it the moment he stepped into view, not from rumors or stories, but from the way the others reacted. The subtle stiffening of their bodies, the quick glances seeking approval. The air shifted. Scarface, Beanie, and the others had postured like predators, But in Cross's presence, they became something else. Followers. Subordinates. This was their alpha. Cross didn't need to shout to command respect. That kind of control came from reputation, from the kind of power that was understood without words. He was in his early 30s, lean but muscular. His clothes were cleaner than the rest, practical but sharp, as though to signal he was above their squalor. His eyes were quick, sharp, scanning the battered alley with the detached calm of someone who had seen violence before, and enjoyed it. His smirk was faint, but cold. This scene didn't shock him. It entertained him. Scarface wiped his bloodied mouth with the back of his hand. His voice wavered between defiance and shame. "We had him, boss. He's tougher than he looks. But we had him." Cross's gaze lingered on Derek, taking him in, calculating. He shook his head slightly, his tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "No, you didn't." The words sliced deeper than any insult. Scarface flinched, but he didn't argue. He knew better. Derek remained silent, his chest heaving from exertion. The bat was still gripped tightly in his hand, blood trickling from his side, his jaw tight. He held Cross's gaze, unblinking. This was different. Scarface and the others were thugs, crude, reckless. Cross was something else. Calculated, dangerous. They were two predators sizing each other up. Cross stepped forward slowly, his tone casual but firm, like someone addressing an inconvenience. "You made a mess. I don't like messes." Scarface's face twitched, his pride wounded, but he bit his tongue. He started to speak. Cross raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. His eyes never left Derek. "You're different. I can see that. You're not like the others here." Derek felt his muscles coil tighter, but he gave nothing away. He knew this was a test. Cross was feeling him out, measuring his strength, his resolve. Derek stayed stone-faced. Cross tilted his head slightly, like a wolf curious about a rival who had wandered into his territory. "I run these streets. When I say someone moves, they move. You've made that difficult today." Derek's voice finally broke the tension. Low, steady, the kind of tone that carried weight. "You come after us again. You'll regret it." Cross's smirk widened, amused, but not dismissive. "Is that a threat?" Derek's eyes didn't waver. A promise. The two men stood there, the world around them fading, the noise of the alley, the distant city hum, all drowned beneath the weight of their locked eyes. The tension was thick, suffocating, like the air had turned to stone. Neither flinched, neither backed down. It was predator against predator, both recognizing the other for what they were. Finally, Cross broke the silence, his voice low, almost amused. "I like fighters, but I break them all the same." There was no bravado in his tone, no empty threat. It was a simple fact, delivered by a man who had done it before, and would do it again. He shifted his stance slightly, but never broke eye contact with Derek. With a subtle tilt of his head, he addressed his men. "Pick them up. We're done here. For now." Scarface and the others scrambled into action, their battered bodies moving with urgency. They helped Tall One to his feet, his face streaked with blood, his leg dragging awkwardly. Beanie wheezed as he was pulled up, clutching his ribs. The newcomers with the bats kept their distance, their aggression tempered by what they had seen. Each one shot a look at Derek, anger still simmering in their eyes, but now accompanied by something else, respect or maybe fear. Either way, it was different. Derek stayed still, bat still in his grip, muscles coiled in case they turned. He watched them limp away, but his focus remained on Cross. Cross lingered as his men retreated, his eyes narrowing slightly as though making a mental note of every inch of Derek. His lips curled into that same cold smirk. But this time there was something behind it. Curiosity, perhaps, or calculation. "I'll be seeing you again," Cross said, his voice quiet but firm, like a promise. Derek didn't blink. "I'll be ready." For a brief moment, Cross's smirk faltered. Just a flicker, barely noticeable, but it was there. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows with his men. The alley fell into silence, the adrenaline still pumping through Derek's veins. He lowered the bat slowly, his grip loosening, but his mind stayed sharp. This wasn't a victory. It was only a delay. Frank shuffled forward, his voice shaky. You okay?" Derek gave a small nod, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Cross had marked him now, not as a victim, but as a threat. And men like Cross didn't let threats walk away unchecked. Derek glanced toward the camp. Maria and Smiley had stepped out, their faces pale, their eyes filled with fear, and something else, admiration. Derek exhaled slowly, the ache in his ribs reminding him that this was far from over. The war had begun. The next morning brought no peace. Derek awoke before dawn, his body protesting every movement. His ribs ached with each breath, and his side was stiff. The dull throb of the knife wound a constant reminder. He peeled back his shirt, examining the jagged cut beneath. It wasn't deep, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that what happened in the alley had escalated the situation. The gang wasn't playing anymore. Reaching for a bottle of water, Derek rinsed the wound, the icy liquid stinging as it traced the raw edges of the slice. He gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain. Pain was familiar. Pain was fuel. Nearby, Maria stirred beneath her tarp, her eyes bloodshot from another sleepless night. She clutched a thin blanket close to her body, but it did little to fight the cold. The fear was etched into her face, exhaustion dragging at her features. Smiley was already up, pacing the perimeter of the camp. His usual crooked smirk was gone. His face was hard, his eyes darting toward every sound. He was afraid, but more than that, he was ready. Everyone had seen the fight the day before. No one spoke of it outright, but Derek could feel the weight of their thoughts. The air was different, tense, fragile. The camp was marked now. Cross had seen them. He had taken note, and everyone knew what that meant. They were right. The first attack came that afternoon. The brick flew without warning, arcing through the sky before smashing into the center of the camp. It shattered a plastic container, the echo of the impact cutting through the uneasy silence. Derek spun around, eyes scanning the alleys. He caught a glimpse of two figures retreating into the shadows, quick and practiced. Scouts, testing their defenses. When the dust settled, they saw the message, spray-painted in bold black letters across the camp wall, larger, angrier this time. "Move and clean up, or we'll burn you alive." The second attack came that night. Derek was sitting near the edge of the camp when he heard it. Quick footsteps, deliberate but trying to be quiet, approaching from the west. He rose slowly, eyes narrowing. 4 silhouettes moved through the shadows, their outlines faint against the dim glow of the city beyond. But Derek was ready. He had spent the day working. Old instincts had resurfaced. He turned scraps into barriers, tripwires fashioned from fishing line, broken bottles hidden under blankets, makeshift barricades of crates and bent poles. This was his world. He had learned these tactics in another life, a life he had buried under the weight of time and regret. But he hadn't forgotten. When the gang stepped into the camp, their overconfidence betrayed them. One of them tripped a wire, sending a cluster of cans clattering loudly into the night. The noise cut through the quiet like an alarm, snapping the camp awake. Another intruder stepped forward blindly, his boot pressing down onto a board laced with rusty nails hidden beneath a ragged tarp. A scream tore from his throat as the metal punctured through his shoe and into his foot. Derek pounced. He emerged from the shadows, pipe in hand, and drove it into the ribs of the nearest thug. The dull, heavy impact was followed by a pained grunt as the man doubled over. Another attacker swung wildly in panic, but Derek was already moving. He ducked under the punch and surged upward, his fist slamming into the man's throat. The attacker staggered back, clutching his neck and choking for air. The rest scattered like rats, their curses fading into the night as they retreated, dragging the wounded with them. But the message was clear. They were not backing down. The third attack broke everything. It came on the third night. More organized, more vicious. Derek sensed it before he saw it. The unnatural quiet, the usual nighttime sounds were off. No faint laughter from neighboring alleys, no shuffling of footsteps in the distance. Instead, there was a stillness that felt deliberate. And then, voices, low murmurs, quickly silenced. It was happening. Derek nudged Smiley awake, his voice low but firm. "Get Maria." "Stay low!" But it was already too late. They came from both sides. 6 men, this time. Larger, coordinated. They slipped past the outer edges of the camp like shadows. Derek's defenses, the wires, the nails, the bottles, they avoided them all. He realized instantly. They had learned, they had watched, studied. This wasn't just a scare tactic anymore. This was an operation. Derek's heart pounded as he rose, pipe clenched in his hand once more. His mind raced, calculating distances, exits, weaknesses. He saw Scarface among them, his nose still crooked from their last encounter. Beanie was there too, favoring his ribs but eager, and behind them, new faces, hardened, focused. Derek knew what this was, not a warning. This was an attempt to end it, for good. Shouts erupted as the gang tore into the camp, boots stomping through the fragile homes of the desperate. Tents ripped open, blankets tossed aside, plastic containers shattered beneath heavy feet. What little these people had was being reduced to debris in seconds. The sounds of destruction mixed with the cries of the helpless. Then, Maria's scream. Derek's head snapped toward the sound. Instinct overtook pain. He sprinted through the chaos, dodging debris and panicked figures. Before he could reach her, a heavy figure came from the side, tackling him with brute force, driving him into the cold, hard ground. Derek's shoulder slammed into the concrete. His ribs flared with agony. He gritted his teeth, twisted his body, and drove his elbow back into his attacker's face. Cartilage crunched. The man cursed, reeling, but before Derek could get up, a boot crashed into his ribs. White-hot pain surged through his side, the same side where the knife had cut him days earlier, but pain fueled him now. Derek forced himself upward, ignoring his screaming body. He surged to his feet and swung his fist into the nearest thug's jaw. The impact was brutal. Teeth snapped loose as the man's head jerked back, and he collapsed in a heap. Derek's eyes darted around the ground. He spotted a broken chair leg, wood splintered into a jagged edge. He snatched it up, fingers tightening around the crude weapon. Maria was trapped near the back wall, 2 gang members closing in. Her hands shook violently as she clutched a small kitchen knife, but her eyes were wide with terror. Smiley was nearby, pressed against a crate, blood dripping from his split lip. He was cornered, but breathing. Derek's voice tore through the madness. "Get away from her!" One of the gang members turned, his lips curling into a cruel smirk. Derek recognized him from before. "You again? You don't know when to stay down." Derek didn't waste words. He exploded forward, gripping the chair leg like a club. He swung low, brutally, connecting with the thug's knee. A sickening crack filled the air. The man screamed as his leg buckled, sending him to the ground. The second attacker lunged, a crowbar raised high. Derek shifted his weight, sidestepping the downward swing. He deflected the blow with his wooden weapon, the impact jolting his arm. Without hesitation, Derek drove his shoulder into the man's chest, slamming him against the wall. Pinned and vulnerable, the thug struggled. But Derek was relentless. He brought his elbow down, once, twice, hammering into the side of the man's head. The attacker slumped, sliding to the ground, unconscious. Breathing hard, Derek turned to Maria and Smiley, his chest rising and falling with the weight of exhaustion and adrenaline. "You okay?" His voice was steady, but his eyes scanned them, searching for injuries. Maria gave a shaky nod, tears streaking her cheeks. "I'm okay." Smiley wiped his bloodied mouth with the back of his hand. "We're good, I think." But there was no time to rest. Before they could catch their breath, a voice cut through the night. Sharp, calm, and controlled. Ethan Cross. "You keep making me come down here," he called out, his tone smooth, but laced with irritation. He stepped into the wreckage of the camp, his boots crunching over broken plastic and shattered belongings. Behind him, his men fanned out like wolves reclaiming ground. Scarface was among them, his nose still crooked and swollen from their last fight. His eyes burned with hatred. Cross's gaze swept over the scene, the torn shelters, the battered faces, the tension hanging in the air. Then his eyes locked onto Derek. "Look at you," Cross said, his voice dipping lower, almost amused. "Sleeping in the dirt, fighting for scraps." He paused, studying Derek, peeling back the layers with his gaze, like a man who had seen broken men before. He tilted his head slightly, his smirk growing. "I get it now. You weren't always down here, were you?" Derek's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but the flicker in his eyes gave away what he didn't speak. Cross's grin widened, sensing the truth. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping into something colder, more personal. "I see it in your eyes. You had a life once, a real one. Now you're playing hero with the rest of this trash." Derek's fists clenched. Derek stepped forward, blood still running down his arm, staining his shirt and dripping onto the dirt below. His breathing was heavy, but his voice was low, steady, carrying the kind of weight that only came from experience. "You don't know a thing about me." Cross's smirk stayed, but the lightness in his tone faded, giving way to something colder. "I know you're holding on to something that's already dead. These people? They're nothing. And you're already halfway there." Derek's fists clenched tighter, his knuckles turning white. He took another step forward, closing the gap between them. His eyes burned with defiance. "I've faced men worse than you, Cross, and I'm still standing." Cross's eyes narrowed, the faintest glint of amusement flickering across his face. "That right?" Derek leaned in slightly, his voice cold as steel, each word deliberate, each syllable sharpened by pain and resolve. "You're fighting a man who's already survived hell." For a brief moment, Cross's smirk faltered. His eyes flickered, not with fear, but with recognition. He had seen men like Derek before, men who didn't break the way others did, but the moment passed quickly. Cross's mask slid back into place. "We'll see," he murmured. "You can't win this. Sooner or later, you'll break." Derek didn't blink. His voice was like stone. "Try me." They stood there, eyes locked, the tension between them almost tangible. Around them, the camp lay in ruins, tents torn, belongings scattered, the wounded breathing heavily in the dark. The faint crackling of a dying fire was the only other sound. Finally, Cross stepped back. He turned to his men with a casual wave of his hand. "We're done here. For now." Scarface scowled, but obeyed. The others followed, some casting glances over their shoulders, anger in some eyes, fear in others. Cross lingered for a heartbeat longer. His gaze met Derek's one final time, a silent message. "This isn't over. This is just getting started," Cross said, his voice low. Derek didn't answer. He watched them fade into the shadows. When they were gone, he turned back to Maria and Smiley, helping them to their feet. Others emerged slowly from their hiding places, faces lined with gratitude, but their eyes heavy with dread. Derek felt it too. Cross wasn't done, but neither was he. The camp bore its wounds openly. Shattered wooden pallets, torn sheets flapping in the breeze, and footprints stamped into the mud, all reminders of the past few nights. Each time Cross and his men retreated, they left scars not just on the camp, but on the people who called it home. Derek surveyed the damage in the morning light, his eyes drawn to Maria, sitting quietly on a plastic crate, her hand wrapped in cloth from the scuffle. Smiley stood nearby, his lips swollen, moving with the stiffness of someone pretending he wasn't hurt. Their bodies were healing, but their eyes, those hadn't recovered. Everyone was watching the edges of the camp now, expecting the next blow. Derek knelt beside Smiley, voice low. "You holding up?" Smiley forced a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, they didn't get me good." Derek didn't push. He knew the real wounds were deeper than bruises. That afternoon, as Derek reinforced the perimeter with makeshift barriers, scrap metal sheets, broken wooden pallets. Smiley slipped away. Derek noticed, but didn't call him back. The kid had his ways of picking up news from the streets, and Derek trusted his instincts. Smiley crept behind a row of dumpsters, careful to keep his steps light. He knew this part of town, a rusted skeleton of what it used to be. The gang often gathered here, away from prying eyes. He had come to listen, to understand what they were planning next. But what he heard was more than he expected. Voices drifted over from behind a crumbling brick wall. Scarface's nasal tone was unmistakable, cocky, but laced with frustration. "Cross says we went too easy on him last night. Thinks we're dragging this out." Another voice, rougher, answered with a laugh. "What's he expect? These rats keep crawling back. We torch their tents. They build more. Break their legs. They crawl." A third chuckled. "We should just kill the lot of them. Line 'em up. Get it over with." Scarface's tone sharpened. "Nah, Haynes doesn't want bodies showing up in the news. Bad for business. He wants 'em gone." But quiet. Smiley froze. Scarface kept talking. "He's paying us good to clear this trash heap. Says once the streets are clean, his people move in. New buildings, new money. We get our cut." The rough voice cut in again, curious. "How much longer we gotta do this?" Scarface spat. "Till it's done. Till they're all gone or dead." Those are his words. The laughter returned. Ugly, casual, like they were discussing pest control. Smiley's pulse quickened. His breath came shallow, but he stayed perfectly still. Pressing his body against the cold brick wall, he waited until their voices faded, then slipped back the way he came. Heart racing, but steps measured. Derek was crouched beside a pile of discarded wood, fashioning it into a more solid barricade. He heard Smiley's hurried footsteps before he saw him, face pale beneath the dirt, eyes wide with what he had learned. "Derek!" Smiley whispered urgently, pulling him behind the broken-down van they used for shelter. Derek immediately stiffened. "What happened?" Smiley licked his cracked lips, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "I found them, Scarface, and the others. I heard them talking." Derek leaned in, eyes narrowing. "Go on." Smiley's voice dropped lower, the weight of what he heard pressing down on him. "They were laughing about what they did last night, but then Scarface said something about Councilman Haynes. He said, Haynes is paying us good to clear this trash heap." Derek's breath slowed. Smiley kept going. One of the others asked how much longer they'd have to keep doing this. Scarface said. He said, "Till it's done, till they're all gone or dead." The words hung between them like a guillotine blade. Derek leaned back against the van, closing his eyes briefly, letting the truth settle in. Haynes. It wasn't just random violence. The attacks, the fear, the destruction, they were sanctioned, paid for. This was a campaign, and Derek's people were the targets. Not for who they were, but for where they were. Lives sacrificed for land. Humanity buried under concrete profits. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, but his eyes burned. "You're sure?" Smiley nodded quickly. "I heard it myself. Scarface wasn't hiding it." Derek exhaled slowly. "Good work." But there was no victory in his tone. There was only resolve. Derek sat beside Maria, her breathing slow, eyes half shut from exhaustion. Smiley rested against a stack of crates, his chest rising and falling steadily. But Derek was awake, staring into the flames. Haynes. This was bigger than Cross, bigger than Scarface. They were just tools. Blunt instruments wielded by a man in a suit, making decisions from a polished office. Derek had fought men with power before. Overseas, in wars they pretended to care about. He knew what power could do when it had no conscience. But this was different. This was home. He clenched his fists. The enemy had a name now. Derek rose with the first light, though sleep had barely touched him. His body was sore, his side still tender from the knife wound. But none of that mattered now. His mind was sharper than it had been in years. He knew what he was fighting now. Not just thugs, not just desperation. He was fighting a system that wanted people like him erased. The truth burned in his chest. Councilman Haynes was paying for this war, and Cross and his crew were just the hammers swinging down on the helpless. Derek knew that the first step to surviving any war was fortifying your ground. If they were going to last, this camp needed to be more than scattered tents and vulnerable bodies. Derek spent the morning working alongside Maria and Smiley. But this time, he wasn't just patching holes or raising flimsy barricades. He was designing a defense. Using scraps from abandoned construction sites and discarded materials scavenged from alleys, Derek directed the residents to build a perimeter with more structure. Stacked pallets, corrugated metal sheets, and even old doors nailed together into walls. He showed Smiley how to weave barbed wire through gaps in the fencing, twisted pieces pulled from an old lot, rusted but still sharp. He instructed Maria on setting up bottleneck pathways, forcing any attacker into narrow entry points where they could be ambushed with pipes and bats. Derek worked until his palms blistered, sweat soaking through his shirt. But the exhaustion felt good. It was the work of men preparing to hold their ground. He knew these defenses wouldn't stop a determined assault. Not completely. But it would slow them down. And in a fight like this, seconds could mean lives. As Derek labored, he pieced together what he knew, assembling the enemy's web in his mind. Councilman Robert Haynes, the smiling face on election posters, always preaching clean neighborhoods and urban renewal. But beneath that polished image, he was orchestrating the purge of the homeless to make way for developers. Cross and his gang, they were just another tool, paid to do the dirty work, protected from the law by Haynes's influence. Derek had seen this kind of corruption overseas, officers padding their pockets while soldiers died in the dirt. He knew how men like Haynes operated. The violence was never personal to them. It was just part of the deal. But it was personal now. Derek wouldn't let them erase these people. By mid-afternoon, Derek made his way toward the precinct. He needed someone inside the system, someone who could shake Haynes's foundation. That's when he heard the name, Detective Laura Briggs. She had a reputation on the streets. A straight cop, tired but not dirty. People said she tried to help when she could, but her patience was thin. Years of seeing the city rot had worn her down. Derek found her just as her shift was ending, leaning against her car in the parking lot, lighting a cigarette, her eyes sunken from too many long days. He approached cautiously. He knew how this looked. A rough man in torn clothes, dried blood on his sleeve. "Detective Briggs?" Derek's voice was steady, but he kept his tone respectful. She sized him up with a glance. "You need a shelter?" "There's a list. I need your help," Derek cut in. "It's about the camps, the violence." Briggs exhaled smoke slowly. She'd heard it before. "We get complaints every week," she said flatly. "Drunks fighting, addicts robbing each other. It's ugly, I get it. But it's not exactly priority one." Derek stepped closer. "This is different. It's organized. I have names. Ethan Cross, Scarface, and I know who's behind them." Briggs's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of Cross, but she masked it quickly. "Who's behind them?" Derek leaned in. "Councilman Haynes. He's paying them to clear us out. People are getting hurt. Some might be dead already." Briggs stiffened, but the flicker of concern was quickly buried under skepticism. "You have proof of that?" Derek's jaw clenched. "Not yet, but I heard it from one of the gang." Briggs shook her head. "That's not proof. That's a rumor. And Cross? He's been a problem for years, but nothing sticks. You think a councilman is giving him orders? You know how that sounds?" Derek's frustration simmered beneath his skin. "I'm telling you the truth." Briggs's expression softened. Just a little. But exhaustion weighed her down. "I believe you think it's the truth. But I need more than talk. Look, I'll put a patrol near your camp. That's all I can do for now." Derek knew what that meant. A patrol wouldn't come until it was too late. But he nodded anyway. "Thanks." As he turned to leave, she called after him. "Stay safe, and don't get any ideas. If you start something, I can't pull you out of it." Derek didn't answer. He was already too deep in it. That night, Derek stood at the edge of the camp, surveying the barriers they had built, a patchwork fortress born from desperation. Across the street, partially obscured by the dark, Cross stood watching. His arms were crossed, his face unreadable, but Derek saw it. The slight tension in his jaw, the longer-than-usual gaze. Cross was starting to see him, not as a nuisance, not as a homeless man, as a threat. Derek met his eyes across the distance. Neither moved, but they both knew what was coming. Derek had started the day early, as he always did now. He had stopped thinking of sleep as rest. It was just a pause between battles. His ribs still ached from the last fight. His side pulled with every breath from the knife wound that had never quite closed right, but he ignored it. The barriers around the camp stood taller now, patched together from wood, scrap metal, and desperation. To someone passing by, it might have looked like progress. To Derek, it looked like a war zone, the kind that had followed him home from places he no longer spoke about. He tightened the final strip of wire over a weak spot in the fencing when he heard the scream. Derek ran, past the rusted van, past the tents, his boots slamming against the cold concrete, toward the narrow alley behind the camp, where he had seen Smiley wander just minutes before. When he rounded the corner, he saw them. Scarface and one of his crew. A tall, wiry thug with a crowbar, standing over Smiley's crumpled body. Smiley was on the ground, his face half buried in the dirt, his arms wrapped around his head. Blood had already smeared his cheek, and Derek could see his wrist twisted at an unnatural angle. Swollen, discolored. Scarface stood over him, boot raised to stomp again. Derek didn't stop to think. He was moving before the shout left his throat. "Get the hell off him!" Scarface's foot came down, landing on Smiley's ribs with a sickening thud, just as Derek collided into him, tackling him into the brick wall. The wiry one swung the crowbar. Derek twisted, feeling the air split as the metal scraped past his shoulder, but it was too slow. He stepped in close, grabbing the man's wrist and driving his fist into his throat. The thug staggered, choking. Scarface recovered quickly, swinging a fist toward Derek's jaw. Derek blocked it, delivering a sharp elbow into Scarface's ribs, the same ribs he had bruised during their first fight. Scarface grunted in pain, but grinned through the blood in his teeth. "You're gonna pay for this, old man." Derek grabbed his collar and slammed him against the wall again, holding him there, face inches away. "I'm still standing," Derek growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can break us? Keep trying." Scarface's grin twitched, but he didn't reply. Instead, he spat blood onto the ground and whistled. Sharp, deliberate. The wiry thug wiped his mouth, regaining his footing, but they didn't move in for more. This wasn't meant to kill Smiley. It was a message. Scarface grinned wider. "See you soon." And with that, they backed away. Casual, cocky, like this had just been a warm-up. Derek knelt beside Smiley. The boy gasped, his face pale, his wrist already swelling grotesquely. They knew you were gone." Smiley managed between shallow breaths. They were waiting. Derek's jaw tightened. This was precision now. Cross was pressing, calculating. "Can you move?" Derek asked. Smiley nodded, though his face twisted in pain as Derek helped him up. "We'll fix the wrist," Derek said, his tone calm, but his heart was pounding with rage. He guided Smiley back to the camp, but before they could reach the safety of their barricades, another sound split the air. Glass breaking, followed by a low roar. Derek's stomach dropped. The smell of smoke followed. Derek's eyes shot toward the far end of the camp, where Maria's new shelter had stood. Flames licked up the fabric, consuming the tarp and wooden frame in seconds. The remnants of her belongings, a stack of canned food, the blanket she had pieced together from her son's old jacket, were already turning to ash. Maria stood frozen, her face blank with shock. She had been helping Charlie nearby, only steps away, and now everything, again, was being taken. Derek rushed toward the fire alongside the others. They tossed dirt and water, smothering the flames with blankets, but it was too late. The structure collapsed into smoldering ruin. Maria stepped forward, kneeling in the soot, her trembling hand reaching for the burnt scraps that had once been her home. Her voice broke. "It's gone, all of it." Derek knelt beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "I know," he said softly. Maria didn't cry. She had no tears left. That night, Derek didn't wait. He sought Cross out. Cross was at his usual corner, leaning against a phone pole flanked by Scarface and two others. They were laughing, but when they saw Derek, the laughter died. Derek crossed the street deliberately, his face hard, his steps slow but heavy. He stopped just a foot away from Cross. "You set her shelter on fire," Derek said, his voice low. "You broke his wrist." Cross didn't blink. "And?" Derek stepped closer, their noses nearly touching. "You're not breaking us." Scarface shifted beside Cross, but Cross raised a hand, keeping him back. "You don't get it, do you?" Cross's tone was calm, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. "You're fighting a war you've already lost. This city doesn't want you. You're nothing but dirt." Derek leaned in, his voice colder than Cross had ever heard. "I've bled for men worse than you. I'm still here. You come at me again. You won't walk away." Their eyes locked. Two men who had fought before, and both knew it would end with one of them in the ground. Cross smirked, but it was thinner now. Forced. "You really think you're gonna win this?" "I don't care about winning," Derek said. "I care about making sure you remember my name when you're choking on your own blood." For the first time, Cross's mask cracked. Just a sliver of doubt, a flicker of fear. Scarface shifted again, uneasy. The gang could feel it too. Derek held Cross's gaze for a long moment, then stepped back. Not in retreat, but as a challenge left hanging in the air. Cross didn't stop him. But when Derek was gone, Cross stayed there longer than usual. Silent, his confidence chipped. Haynes had promised easy money. This was becoming something else. And for the first time, Cross wondered if he had been lied to. The smoke from Maria's burned shelter had long dissipated, but its scent lingered in the fabric of the camp, an invisible scar. Smiley's wrist was wrapped tightly with torn cloth, his face still swollen. Though he insisted, he was fine. Maria worked beside Derek without words. Her grief hardened into a cold focus. Everyone knew the gang would return. But Derek wasn't waiting for the next hit. He was moving first. Derek had been on the streets long enough to learn where deals were made and secrets were whispered. The alley behind the old meatpacking warehouse, a forgotten strip of brick and decay, was one such place. He had heard Smiley mention it once, a spot Cross used when he didn't want eyes on him. That's where Derek went that night. He had nothing but a cheap burner phone, its cracked screen barely holding together, and a heart full of resolve. He waited in the shadows, still as stone, for nearly an hour before the voices came. Cross's voice, sharp, irritated. "You want it faster? Then give us more muscle." Then a second voice, slick and confident. "Councilman Haynes, you have what you need. I pay you to handle problems, not make more." Derek's hand tightened around the phone as it recorded, every word clear in the stillness. Cross's tone shifted, a hint of defiance bleeding through. "These people aren't rolling over. You didn't say they'd fight like this." Haynes's reply was colder than Derek expected. "Your job is to make sure there's nothing left to fight. If you can't handle that, I'll find someone who can." Derek could feel the tension in Cross's silence, pride scraping against fear. But Cross eventually yielded. "It'll get done." The conversation ended. Footsteps faded into the night. Derek checked the phone. 22 seconds of damning truth. Not enough to convict, but enough to start a fire. Derek found Detective Laura Briggs the next afternoon, this time catching her outside a corner deli as she grabbed a quick lunch, her exhaustion evident in the way she leaned against the wall while checking her phone. She noticed him immediately, her eyes wary, but not hostile. "You again?" she said, more tired than annoyed. Derek handed her the phone without preamble. "Press play." Briggs raised an eyebrow, but complied. Her casual posture stiffened the moment Haynes's voice crackled through the speaker. She listened to the full recording, then replayed it. When it ended, she stared at the phone for a long moment, her jaw tight. "This is real?" Her voice was quieter now, serious. Derek nodded. "I saw them. I heard it." Briggs exhaled slowly. "This is something. It's not enough to take him down, but it's more than I've had in years." She glanced at Derek, and for the first time, he saw respect in her eyes, but also caution. "You understand what you're stepping into, right? Haynes isn't just a councilman. He has friends. If I push this, he'll push back. Hard." Derek's voice was steady. "I'm already in it." Briggs considered him for a moment, then gave a faint nod. "I'll start digging, but if I'm putting my badge on the line, I need more. Something that ties him to the bodies. Money, a paper trail, witnesses." Derek knew what she meant. She needed Cross. Derek found Cross later that night, standing at the edge of his usual haunt, a vacant lot near the liquor store. Scarface and the other hangers-on were nearby, but Derek ignored them. He walked straight to Cross. "You talked to Haynes last night," Derek said. Cross's eyes narrowed, caught off guard. "What?" "I heard everything," Derek pressed. "I've got it recorded. You and your boss planning to bury us." Cross's smirk faltered, only for a second, but it was there. "You're bluffing," Cross snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. Derek stepped closer, voice low. "You think Haynes is gonna back you up when this goes public? Or is he gonna leave you bleeding in an alley while he shakes hands with his developer friends?" Scarface stirred uneasily behind Cross. The other men were listening. Derek leaned in, just close enough that only Cross could hear the next part. "This ends one way. You come for me, or I come for you. But when it's done, your name's the one they'll read in the papers. Gang leader falls, councilman walks free." Cross's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding audibly. He hated this. Hated that Derek was forcing him onto unstable ground, making him choose between loyalty to Haynes and his own survival. But Derek could see the shift. The seed of doubt planted back in the alley was growing. "I'll be waiting," Derek said, stepping back. "Bring everything you've got." He turned and walked away. Not quickly, deliberately. Cross didn't follow, but Derek knew what he had done. The final fight was coming. After Derek was gone, Cross stood there long after his men had drifted away, their laughter distant echoes. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. Haynes had money, power, influence, but Derek had something else: conviction and the truth. And Cross was trapped between them. He lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, but the nicotine didn't calm him. He knew what had to come next. One more job. Kill Derek. Break the camp. But for the first time, he wasn't sure if he would win. The night was colder than usual. A sharp wind howled through the alleys, carrying the bitter scent of burnt plastic and damp concrete. Derek stood near the edge of the camp, his eyes fixed on the dark outlines of the buildings beyond, the places where Cross's men lurked like jackals. The message had been delivered, the challenge accepted. Tonight, it would end. He had prepared as much as he could. The barricades tightened, the few able-bodied residents standing ready to protect the vulnerable. But Derek knew none of that would matter if he failed. This fight wasn't about defending the camp anymore. It was about breaking Cross. Footsteps echoed from the west, heavy, deliberate. Derek tensed, his grip tightening around a length of iron pipe he had scavenged earlier. He knew this wasn't like the other nights. This wasn't a raid. This was the endgame. Cross stepped into view, flanked by 6 men, Scarface among them, his face still bruised from their last encounter. They didn't sneak this time. They wanted to be seen. Derek stepped forward, his eyes locked onto Cross. "You ready?" Cross's voice was low, almost casual, but there was tension beneath it, the weight of every decision that had brought them here. Derek nodded. "Are you?" Cross's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. He signaled with his hand, and his men fanned out, circling the camp's edge like wolves testing a wounded bear. Derek raised his voice. Not loud, but firm enough to reach those hiding behind the barricades. "This is my fight. Stay back!" Maria peeked from the shadows, her eyes wide with fear, but she trusted him. She nodded once, pulling Smiley deeper into the camp. The ring closed. Cross moved first. He came in fast, faster than Derek expected, throwing a brutal right hook aimed at Derek's ribs. Derek twisted, absorbing part of the blow, but pain shot through his side. He swung the pipe toward Cross's knee, but Cross stepped back just in time, his reflexes sharper than his men's. This wasn't a street thug. This was a man who had fought his way to the top. Scarface lunged from the side, but Derek anticipated it. Whipping the pipe upward into Scarface's chin, the thug dropped like dead weight, groaning as he clutched his face. Another man charged. Derek sidestepped, driving his elbow into the attacker's temple, sending him sprawling against the barricade. Cross used the distraction. He tackled Derek, driving him into the ground. Concrete scraped against Derek's back as they grappled. Cross's fists rained down, one connecting with Derek's cheek, splitting the skin. Derek grunted, twisting his hips, flipping Cross onto his back. They scrambled to their feet, both breathing heavily, blood already staining their clothes. Cross wiped his mouth, his eyes narrowing. "You think this ends with me?" Derek didn't reply. He stepped forward, delivering a sharp jab to Cross's ribs, the same spot he had targeted before. Cross staggered, but recovered quickly. They exchanged blows, brutal, unrelenting. Derek's fists found their mark: Cross's face, his ribs, his shoulder. But Cross was tough. He absorbed the pain and gave it back. A knee to Derek's gut stole his breath. A hook to Cross's jaw nearly sent him to the ground. Blood splattered onto the concrete beneath them. Neither gave ground, but Derek could see it now. Cross was tiring. His anger drove him forward, but his body was slowing. Derek pressed the advantage. He feinted left, then drove his fist into Cross's solar plexus. Cross gasped, his body buckling. Derek didn't let him recover. He tackled him again, pinning him down. Their eyes locked, Cross's filled with rage and desperation, Derek's with cold finality. Derek raised his fist, ready to end it, but he stopped. His hand trembled for a second before lowering. Cross stared up at him, confused. Derek leaned in, his voice a rough whisper. "You don't get to die easy. You're going to talk. You're going to tell them everything about Haynes." Cross's chest heaved. You think I'll sell him out?" Derek's eyes hardened. "You will. Because if you don't, I will come back for you. And next time, I won't stop." Cross's bravado cracked. The fear was real now. Derek stood up, wiping the blood from his mouth. Cross remained on the ground, coughing, defeated. The gang that had gathered, Scarface, the others, they watched their leader fall. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the first man stepped back. Then another. Scarface glanced at Cross, but there was no loyalty in his eyes anymore. They turned and fled into the night, their confidence shattered. Derek stood tall, not because he had won, but because he had endured. Cross remained there, broken, alone. The man who had ruled the streets was now nothing more than a loose end, waiting to be tied off. Word spread fast. By sunrise, Cross's name carried no power. His men were scattered, some hiding, others joining rival crews. The fear that had once gripped the camp was replaced with whispers of hope. Derek had not just defended them. He had broken the hand that held the knife, but it wasn't over. Haynes still stood, and Derek knew Cross was now his weapon to bring him down. The days following Cross's fall were quiet, but it was not the calm of peace. It was the silence before judgment. Derek moved through the camp with his usual focus, but there was something different in his eyes now. Something resolved. The people noticed it too. They watched him with a mixture of respect and gratitude, but also the quiet understanding that he was preparing for something bigger. Cross was gone, at least in the way that mattered. His men had scattered, and the streets whispered about how their leader had been broken by the man from the camp. But Derek knew the real enemy still sat behind polished doors and cameras, smiling for the press. Councilman Haynes. The night after the fight, Derek met Cross one last time. Not in an alley, but in the dim, abandoned garage where Cross had once ruled. Cross's face was still swollen, his pride crushed beneath the bruises, but there was no fight left in him. He knew the only thing keeping him breathing was the man standing across from him. Derek handed him a burner phone. "When they call, you answer. You tell them everything," Derek said, his voice cold, deliberate. "Names, dates, money. You're done with Haynes." Cross stared at the phone like it was a grenade. "And if I don't?" Derek leaned in. "You know what happens." Cross nodded slowly. Derek didn't need to say more. The choice had already been made. 3 days later, Councilman Haynes stood in front of cameras, his pristine suit pressed, his smile confident as he delivered his latest promise to the public. Another speech about revitalizing the city, attracting investors, cleaning up the streets. It was the same lie wrapped in different words, but the crowd nodded along until the sirens cut through the air. Gasps rippled through the gathering as 2 squad cars pulled to the curb. Detective Briggs stepped out, her badge visible, her posture unyielding. Behind her, officers fanned out, their presence not theatrical, but final. Haynes's smile flickered. Briggs approached the podium, her voice calm but sharp enough to slice through his practiced rhetoric. "Councilman Robert Haynes, you are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and orchestrating violent attacks on homeless communities." The cameras swung toward them, reporters latching onto the moment like vultures. Haynes raised his hands in protest, but his face was pale now, sweat beading at his temple. "This is outrageous! I serve this city." Briggs cut him off. "We have the recordings. We have witness testimony." Haynes's mouth opened, but no words came. Cross's name hung in the air like a curse. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The crowd, once so ready to applaud his vision, was now murmuring with shock, disgust, and anger. Cameras zoomed in on his face, flashing bulbs capturing the unraveling of a man who had built his fortune on the backs of the forgotten. The truth was out. Derek watched from across the street. Hidden in the crowd, his hood up, he didn't smile. He didn't celebrate, but he felt the weight lift. Just a little. The story spread faster than fire. News anchors dissected every word of the recordings. Headlines screamed corruption, betrayal, abuse of power. Haynes's connections tried to distance themselves, but the evidence was too clear. Cross's confession was everywhere. The gang leader turning against his employer to save himself. For the first time, the eyes of the city turned toward those they had ignored for so long. The camps, the people like Maria, Smiley, Charlie, were no longer just shadows in alleys. They were victims, survivors, human. And at the center of it all was the story of one man, the one they called Derek Williams, the veteran who had stood his ground. Journalists came to the camp the next day, cameras trailing them like vultures hungry for more. "Mr. Williams? How does it feel to be a hero?" one asked, microphone pushed toward his face. "You exposed corruption at the highest level. What's next for you?" Derek looked past the cameras, to Maria helping Charlie repair his tent, to Smiley, wrist in a proper cast now, laughing with 2 others as they shared a meal. These were his people. He met the reporter's gaze, his voice steady. "I'm not leaving." The reporter frowned, confused. "You could use this. Go anywhere. Start over." Derek shook his head. "There's still work to do. I'm staying." The cameras clicked, but Derek was already walking away. Back to the camp. Back to the people he had bled for. The city moved on quickly, as cities always did. Haynes's fall had been sensational news, but the headlines faded after a week, replaced by fresher scandals and brighter distractions. Yet, for those who lived under the overpasses and along the forgotten streets, everything had changed. Derek walked through the camp that morning, not as a soldier watching for threats, but as a man seeing what they had built together. The barricades had been repurposed, not for defense, but to mark new boundaries for a community. The ash from Maria's fire had been swept away, replaced by a sturdy frame covered in donated tarps, her new shelter stronger than before. Smiley was gathering cans with his good hand, his cast painted with crude drawings from the younger kids in the camp. And for the first time in weeks, Derek could hear laughter. It hadn't come easily. The news coverage had brought brief sympathy from the public. Donations of blankets, food, and tents arrived in waves. But Derek knew charity was not the same as change. He had met with Briggs, this time in a community center, not a parking lot. She had listened as he spoke, not as a witness, but as a man who had seen the cracks in the system. Together, they pushed for something lasting. By the month's end, a pilot outreach program was launched, focused on providing medical aid, addiction support, and paths to housing for homeless veterans and the displaced. Derek didn't ask for his name to be attached to it, but his hands were in every brick and every plan. Maria stood at the front of the new tent that served as the outreach hub, her clipboard in hand, eyes sharp with focus. She had stepped forward naturally, taking on the role of organizer, listener, and advocate. People trusted her. Derek watched her guide a woman who had just arrived, pregnant, scared, toward the medical tent. Maria caught his eye across the lot. She smiled. Not the strained one from before, but something real. Derek nodded, knowing she had found her strength again, not in what she lost, but in what she was building. Smiley's cast came off 2 weeks later. His wrist was stiff, but he carried himself differently now, straighter, more confident. The boy who had once relied on quick jokes to mask his fear now spoke with pride, leading a group of younger residents as they sorted supplies. Derek overheard him explaining how to secure a tent flap properly against the wind, his voice steady, authoritative. Derek didn't interrupt. He just listened. The kid who had once needed saving was now helping others stand. One evening, Derek sat beside the fire, not because he needed warmth, but because it had become a place of gathering. Maria sat beside him, chatting softly with Smiley and another resident. Their laughter mixed with the crackling wood. Derek leaned back, letting the sounds fill the quiet spaces inside him. The spaces war had carved out, the ones he thought would stay empty forever. He had been asked, more than once, if he would leave. With Haynes gone and Cross broken, he could start fresh, take the recognition and build something elsewhere. But Derek knew the truth. This was his place now. He wasn't staying because he had nothing else. He was staying because he had found everything here. When the world turned its back, he would stand with those left behind. He was their protector, and he always would be. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.